Our investigation into the death of Princess Diana starts here, at Eltham Palace, known as the Secret Palace, just a few miles from central London. This is where the young Henry VIII grew up, and several centuries later, when the palace was occupied by the wealthy Courtaulds family, Eltham Palace became the headquarters of an organisation which evolved into what we now call MI6, Overseas British Military Intelligence. This is the oldest bridge in London. It was here on the banks of the moat that Henry VIII composed his famous song, Greensleeves. Henry VIII is also remembered for having 6 wives, but what he is least remembered for is being a murderer. Henry VIII ordered the execution of his wife, Anne Boleyn, simply because she had not bared him a son. Anne was imprisoned and beheaded before a court of nobility at the Tower of London. Henry also ordered the execution of several men who he falsely claimed had committed adultery with Anne. Anne's daughter succeeded the throne as Elizabeth I. In September 1560, 2 years into her reign, the 27-year-old Queen Elizabeth I was implicated in a suspected murder of Lady Robert Dudley, the wife of Lord Robert Dudley, who was Queen Elizabeth's secret lover. The coroner's jury returned a verdict of accidental death. Queen Elizabeth made Lord Dudley the Earl of Leicester, but they never married for fear of the mass speculation and suspicions throughout Britain, causing them both to be accused of murder. On the 1st of February 1587, Queen Elizabeth I ordered the execution of her half-sister, Mary, Queen of Scots. However, Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I were not the first murdering monarchs to occupy the royal throne. They were descended from a long aristocratic tradition of crowned killers who would often savour a passion for black magic. 80 years prior to Queen Elizabeth I's reign, in 1483, King Richard III commissioned Sir James Tyrrell to kill his nephews, the young Prince Edward and Prince Richard. In the dead of night, Sir James Tyrrell and 2 assistants smothered the young princes, thus ensuring the bloodline of Richard III became the new monarchy of Britain. Prior to King Richard murdering the 2 young princes, in 1477, the Duke of Clarence said that his brother, King Edward, practiced the black arts and used his knowledge of witchcraft to concoct poisons for the king's enemies. The Scottish King Macbeth was one of several early Scottish monarchs who were crowned killers. Many times, aided and abetted by sorcerers and witches, Scottish noblemen would kill a king, seize the throne for themselves, and then in turn meet with a violent death at the hands of another murdering monarch. In 1437, King James of Scotland was stabbed to death by a bunch of henchmen wielding swords and daggers. They were ordered to kill King James I by the Earl of Athol, who claimed he was the rightful King of Scotland. The King's son, James II, stabbed to death the 8th Earl of Douglas in 1452. The Earl was the biggest landowner in Scotland. 3 years after being murdered by the King, the Earl's land was annexed by the Crown Estates. Well, I knew at one point today that we were going to discuss the subject of treason and what happens to people who are guilty of treason. Diana was most certainly a person who committed very, very serious treason. The Panorama interview that Martin Bashir did with Diana is one long treasonous offence. I think that if Diana had not committed treason, if she had not made that Panorama documentary, then the chances are that she would still be alive to this day. Well, what I've done is I've brought along a few books today that are from my own personal collection. I've got a huge library. Some of my books go back to the medieval era, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th century manuscripts and that kind of thing. And there is this whole notion that was suggested in David Icke's book, The Biggest Secret, which really portrayed the crash in the tunnel as being the beginning of a whole ritual sacrifice of Diana. And of course, people that were guilty of treason were ritually sacrificed. And I made a film recently in my series of Illuminati films called Murdered by the Monarchy. And in that film you can see the terrible ritual killing of people who had their bodies cut into different pieces, and they used to cut the heart of the traitor out and put this on display publicly, and parts of the body of the traitor were distributed for various rituals amongst the aristocratic and royal nobility, the elite of Europe. And people say to me, it's not true, is it, that royal people are involved in black magic? Well, I just laugh at that, because the whole of the European royal elite, the aristocratic, noble, political, leading elite of society throughout the whole of history have been involved in the occult. And so I've brought a few books along today to just illustrate some of the most notorious black magician type characters that have populated the ranks of royal families and the nobility and the aristocracy throughout the ages. So I think we just have a look at them here. This is the castle, the famous castle at Taufouge in France, which was previously the home of a very wealthy man called Gilles de Retz, or Gilles de Retz. Now, he was the Marshal of France, a very successful military career. He retired at an early age in his mid-20s, and he then took on the study of black magic in this castle. And he was a member of the nobility. He'd formerly assisted Joan of Arc in her campaigns against the British. And he performed black magic rituals in this castle with the help of an Italian priest called Preletti. And so many children were going missing wherever Gilles de Retz appeared that eventually his black magic came under the scrutiny of the authorities, and he was eventually arrested, tortured, and executed. And he was executed on charges of taking no less than 150 children, though it's quite likely that he was responsible for the sacrifice, so the killing, and sadomasochistic black magic rituals with these children, probably in the number of thousands and thousands of children. And this kind of thing is still going on in France and Belgium and the United Kingdom amongst the nobility to this day. And we know this because there was a famous case in Belgium recently. A chap called Marc Dutroux was arrested, and he was found in possession of keys to dungeons which were located under houses in suburban areas in Belgium. And these children were kept imprisoned. They'd been snatched, and these children were just some of the literally millions of people that go missing every year. And Marc Dutroux's confession alleges that all he was doing was procuring children for sadomasochistic use by very, very wealthy people in Belgium. He claims that certain members of the European nobility were involved. And of course the word sadomasochism, or the term sadomasochism, sado is from the name of Sade, the Marquis de Sade, who's another member of the French nobility, and he used to, get young girls from local villages and used to partake in sadomasochistic, horrible, evil kind of soirees. This is the famous Madame de Montespan, who was the mistress of King Louis XIV of France. Ms. Montespan actually hired a black magician to put a spell on the king's wife to ensure that the king's wife would never have any children. She was also the employer of a priest who used to perform black masses. This priest was called Abbé Guibourg, and he used to perform various black masses for members of nobility and perform sacrifices of children with a naked woman laying on the altar. And again, we see this link between royalty and sacrifice. It's it's historically, it's all there, except it's been swept under a very plush carpet. Well, Hampton Court Palace is one of the most haunted places, not only in Britain, but in the entire world. And it was the official palace, the official residence of the royal family. It was originally built in the 1200s, and then it was massively added to in the 1500s. And many famous royal people have had their homes at Hampton Court. Henry VIII is one, and Henry VIII was a psychopath. He was somebody that would fly into royal tempers, and he would decree that a certain person had committed adultery and therefore had committed treason, and would behead them. Not a very nice chap at all, Henry VIII, even though he wrote a good piece of music called Greensleeves. Now, one of his wives that he accused of being adulterous and therefore being treasonous was a woman called Catherine Howard. And Catherine Howard realised as soon as that she had been accused of adultery, she knew that she was going to have her head cut off. So she ran to see the king to plead mercy for him, but she never made it because the palace guards arrested her and dragged her away. And still to this day, from time to time, you can hear the screams of the ghost of Catherine Howard. And she was dragged away through a part of the palace which is now called the Haunted Gallery. You know, there's no doubt that Hampton Court is most definitely infested with psychic activity and with ghosts. One of the most common things that happens at Hampton Court is that this grey ghostly mist hangs above the floors in the kitchens, and this is ectoplasm. And I made a film called Spirit World which discusses ectoplasm, and many of the people that work in the kitchens of Hampton Court, which is, you know, partly opened to the public each day, many people who work in those kitchens have seen this ectoplasm, which is a mist. Hampton Court is a gigantic structure. It's a gigantic royal palace. It's more than 1,000 individual rooms. Now, one of these rooms were recently discovered. I go back now to the time of Henry VIII. Henry VIII's wife, Jane Seymour, she died giving birth to the young Prince Edward. The young prince had a nurse who was called Mrs. Penn, and this is in the 1500s. And she was buried actually inside Hampton Court grounds at the old chapel. But in the 1800s, that chapel was demolished and her grave was disturbed. And from that moment onwards, workmen kept hearing this kind of constant whirring sound coming from behind a wall in Hampton Court Palace. So eventually a decision was made to actually tear this wall down and find out what was the source of this whirring sound. Well, as soon as they pulled the wall down, the sound stopped. But they found a room, a previously forgotten small room, a small chamber, and inside that chamber was a spinning wheel, exactly the same type of spinning wheel that Mrs. Penn, the nurse of the young Prince Edward, had used when she was alive. It's very rare to see a photo of a ghost where you can see the entire shape of the body. That is extremely rare. It's quite common to see a hand, and obviously it's even more common to sense the feeling that there is a ghost there, but not see anything. And in the so-called haunted gallery at Hampton Court, tourists have been punched by poltergeists, which is a term which is used to describe a ghost which has a lot of kinetic power, and it can actually move objects, and it can touch people, and it can punch you. But it's very, very rare to have a ghost who has telekinetic power, can actually move physical objects, and at the same time is actually visible. Now, in October 2003, a very, very strange incident occurred. On the first day, alarms went off in a part of Hampton Court which is used for exhibitions. And these alarms are linked to fire escape doors. And it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and guards went down and they found these doors open. There was nobody there. And so they just closed the doors. Well, the next day, the same thing happened. At the same time, about 1 p.m. lunchtime. This is in full daylight. And the closed-circuit TV cameras really picked up something that was, to my experience, totally unique in terms of footage that you usually see of ghosts. The footage wasn't released to the public for 2 months. It came to be in the public domain in December 2003. It makes me wonder what was going on for 2 months with people, I dare say, analysing this footage. If that is a ghost, I have to say, having made a full-on feature-length documentary called Spirit World, all about spirits and ectoplasm and electronic voice phenomena and hauntings, I have to say that this piece of footage from Hampton Court Palace, if that is a ghost, is the world's singular most incredible piece of ghost footage. This person, or this figure, is displaying tremendous power to make those doors fly open and then to slam them shut with such force that one of the doors actually bounces back open again. If it is a ghost, then we're dealing with a full physical apparition, and a ghost which has got poltergeist strength in its spirit. It takes a huge amount of energy for a spirit to manifest itself into a visible form. And then it takes a huge amount of extra effort for it to then interact with physical objects. This is why poltergeists are usually only sensed, and only the objects which they move are seen by witnesses. The actual poltergeist itself is rarely ever seen. Well, the other question, of course, is could this just be a person? Now, there are tour guides at Hampton Court Palace who dress in period costumes. And I visited the palace in the winter of 2004. I got there and it was fairly dark, but they were still doing these tours with the tour guides dressed in traditional costume holding lanterns. Now, the costumes which I saw bear no resemblance to the clothes which this strange character is seen wearing. In actual fact, the robes which the figure is wearing are really the kinds of robes that an alchemist or a magician of the 16th century or of the medieval era, somebody like Agrippa or Abraham the Jew, these magicians wore robes exactly like we see in the video footage from the closed-circuit TV camera. My conclusion so far is not really made. What I would say at this point is that 4 years have passed. If this was a tour guide or it was somebody having a practical joke at the palace, there's been more than enough time for that to come to light. If it's a ghost, then this is the most remarkable ghost footage ever. If it's a person, then this is obviously a person who wants privacy. They're slamming those doors closed. Their demeanour, their movements suggest that they are in a huff. They're in a, there's no time to lose, slam those doors, get back inside kind of attitude. Now, of course, there is one other possible hypothesis, and that goes back to the research which was exposed by David Icke in The Biggest Secret, where he quotes the sources, people who say that they had attended rituals at royal palaces. And Hampton Court is one of these places which is steeped in the history of the royal bloodline of Great Britain. There is no question that at the time of Henry VIII, murder by magic was accepted as fact by the nobility, the aristocracy, and the royalty. There was a famous case involving a witch, a woman who was accused of witchcraft. Her name was Mabel Brigg. This is during the life of Henry VIII, and she was arrested under the suspicion that she tried to kill Henry VIII using witchcraft. Well, the fact that the order was sent out to arrest her is proof enough that the royals have, throughout the ages, taken magic and magical ritual and spells very, very, very seriously indeed. So, this could be somebody, a person, dressed as a medieval magician, dressed in actual fact in the same kind of robes that are described by the eyewitnesses that supplied information to David Icke for his book The Biggest Secret. This could be a person who's partaking in a magical ritual which is taking place inside a royal palace. And this is exactly the scenario which is described in the book by David Icke.
It's no accident that the Queen's present Queen's grandmother is a direct descendant from the sister of Vlad Dracul, on whom the Dracula stories are named. Are based. So Diana knew this, and then I come across people like an American lady, Arizona Wilder, who again was involved and a victim of this mind control project, and was used to conduct rituals for them. Under a mind controlled state, they are mind controlled to conduct these rituals in a certain way.
And these were taking place on royal properties in Scotland.
Yes, exactly, in Balmoral, and there's a particular place in Belgium which is known as the Mothers of Darkness Castle, which is funnily located in the same area that child murder and satanic ring was based, that came to light, clearly involving the establishment figures of Belgium, and was a massive cover-up. When a real investigator, a prosecutor, got involved, of course, they had to get rid of him, and 300,000 Belgians went on the march one day in protest at the cover-up. Well, all these things interconnect, and she told me that she and another two of such people have told me the same story, that she was actually in Britain at rituals at which Diana was being abused in part of these rituals in a mind-controlled state, because there's no question whatsoever that when you talk to the people I've talked to, that Princess Diana was one of the victims of mind control. One of the things that they do is they mind control the children of the aristocratic families, again, for a reason we've discussed, which is the Illuminati mind, which is different to the regular run of human mind. It cannot stand the thought that it's not controlling events. Therefore, it does not want cuckoos in the bloodline nest. Therefore, it makes sure that the kids undergo mind control from an early age, which is why so many of these aristocratic families are so bloody dysfunctional, because they're all kind of, had their minds played with.
They're bred from birth to serve a role.
Exactly. Diana's role, and I'm not kidding, from birth, would have been to have been sacrificed in that place at that time. And people, and I understand, will find that staggering and impossible to believe. Well, you should have been around me for the last 14 years, and it wouldn't be impossible to believe. And her other role was to had her genes to the Windsors, because if we want to get really bizarre, the Windsors are not, like these Illuminati bloodlines in general, are not the same DNA as the rest of the global population, and they need an infusion of human genetics to hold the balance of their DNA between the human and what they really are, which is actually not human as we understand human. And what was happening, as Christine Fitzgerald, this close confidant of Diana for 9 years, explained to me, was that the genes of the Windsors were getting too imbalanced to the non-human side. And it was going to become clear within a very few generations that they weren't all that they seemed to be. And what they needed was an infusion of human genes. And as I've written in my books for years, and so many insiders have told me, and others, the key genetics that these people like to interbreed with are blonde-haired, blue-eyed people. Now, where did I hear that before? Oh yes, Hitler's master race. And they want to preserve this master race because they need to keep interbreeding with that genetics. So, yeah, exactly.
Those traits with the Spencer family.
Exactly. So what happens? They bring Diana in. What does Diana say in her accounts that she allowed to be published in various books? That once the children were born, Charles basically was saying to her, that's it.